recording in progress. And it was quite eye-opening to hear the perspective from landowners of what they thought the government was doing. And you didn't always get positive response, so you kind of had to deal with that not everyone was going to agree with what the policy was. But overall, it was a really interesting experience. I guess what I enjoyed most about it was just gaining some familiarity with how policy is applied on the ground, how to communicate that policy. But the hardest part I found of working for government was the need to be objective and not have an opinion on what's going on. And often that's difficult when policy can have an impact on people's livelihoods. So I suppose after 2 and a bit years, I started to get itchy feet. I enjoyed working with all the people in government. There were some real good characters, some old timers, some young people as well. But after 2 and a bit years, it started to feel a little bit like this. Ooh. Sorry, my presentation is just paused. One moment. There we go. And so I kind of felt like I wanted to do something a bit more practical again. And also the pace of the government felt a little bit slow for where I was at in my career. So I decided to get back into research again. And this led to a great opportunity in Sydney. So I moved down to Sydney with my partner and met a couple of great researchers at UNSW, including Richard Kingsford, and found a really great project working on waterbirds in the Macquarie Marshes. So for those of you that don't know, the Macquarie Marshes are based maybe 5 hours or so northwest of Dubbo. So semi-remote, semi-arid, and a real boom and bust kind of environment where you'll go from it being super dry and dusty, and then literally overnight things will just start growing out of the ground when a water event arrives. And the system or the environment around the Macquarie Marshes had been heavily regulated, is still regulated to a degree. There's a cotton industry that relies on irrigation channels, and these irrigation channels are filled from the dam upstream near Dubbo. And then there's also quite a large cattle industry as well. So overall, landholders that were very supportive of research and of environmental flows in particular into the system tended to be the cattle farmers, whereas the cotton industry weren't quite so positive about environmental water because, of course, they would rather it be directed to cotton. So that was interesting. But essentially my projects led me to do 3 separate surveys before, during and after the flow event in 2014. And this wasn't a huge environmental flow event, relatively speaking, but it was enough to really see the contrast. And because the whole of the marshes wasn't inundated at any one time, it allowed me to kind of compare lagoon sites to floodplain sites with dry areas in between and really see the difference that water makes. And one of the questions I guess I was asking was how does this environmental flow affect these different functional groups of waterbirds? So ducks versus pelicans versus large waders and shorebirds. And really this was leading to how can this help water managers manage environmental flow better. So if we have a better understanding of how waterbirds are influenced by flow at different times, then we can time our releases accordingly. A few learnings along the way. Like I said, it can get wet very fast. So I got caught out more than once. And that's Mia, one of my volunteers in the photo there. we had to walk to quite a few sites, which would often take sometimes more than an hour just to get in, because the mud was just like an ice rink as soon as the water touched it. And often my rental car wasn't really up to the task. So I bogged myself a few times and probably had a bit of a reputation amongst the landholders for getting myself into a bit of trouble. And one time in particular, I got bogged in a part of a farmer's crop and was stuck there for about 4 hours in the sun and didn't get picked up until a pig shooter kind of came by and pulled me out. So that was interesting. So my master's eventually led to an internship opportunity out in South Australia near Mount Gambier. I presented my master's research at the Ecological Society of Australia conference, and I met a lady there, Kath. I'm trying to remember her last name, but she worked for an organisation called Nature Glenelg Trust. Kath Dixon, that's her name. And she said, look, I think you'd be really interested in this internship. And it just seemed like a perfect bridge from my master's to something, my first, opportunity to work with a NGO. So I took that up and moved to Mount Gambier for 3.5, 4 months. And a little bit about Nature Glenelg Trust, for those of you that don't know, they started out as a group of people that used to work for the South Australian government and decided to form this organisation to do some on-ground conservation. In particular, now they buy up property and restore wetlands out that way. But at the time, my project was focused on the southern brown bandicoot and looking at digging abundance and comparing that to some previous years. So I was out there in 2016 and I was comparing my digging abundance results to the 2 years prior. And this was in a region that was kind of dotted with forestry. So I was essentially doing a lot of surveys in these quite beautiful remnant patches of forest that was surrounded by plantation forest, and also incidentally really good red-tailed black cockatoo habitat. So yeah, this was a great experience. I never actually got to see a bandicoot. However, I did see one via remote trapping, a couple via remote trapping, which was really great. And there was definitely plenty of activity in a lot of these remnants from their conical shaped burrows, which I should have provided a photo of. And this led to a report, which I've pictured there. And so yeah, overall, this was just a great experience working as an independent field tech. It involved a lot of being in the field on my own and collecting lots of bandicoot data. But yeah, great group of people out there, and got quite involved in some other projects, including owl surveys as well. So lived in Mount Gambier for about 4 months that winter, and then decided that I was ready to go back to the city. And I was a member of the EIANZ, the Environment Institute of Australia and New Zealand, and they had a mentorship program, which I think they still do. And through that mentorship program back in Melbourne, I met a contact from a consulting company called Biosis. And that eventually led to my first consulting job. So a little bit about consulting, very, very fast paced, definitely a different feel to, say, working for an NGO that's all conservation focused. Obviously, consulting relies on development, really, and it's all about understanding the legislation so that development can or can't happen. It also is really eye-opening and gives you some great experience on how to apply legislation like the EPBC Act, which I think is really valuable down the track in whatever other work you want to do. So I've just provided an example here of one of the projects that I worked on. A lot of the work that I did in consulting was centered around Melbourne because of all the housing development happening. So especially in Victorian Volcanic Plain kind of area, grasslands. But I also did some work way up at Hatter Lakes at one point, which was really fun, doing some water bird surveys up there. And then this one that I'm going to talk more about, which was actually a wind farm project in central Gippsland, which is about 2 or 3 hours east of Melbourne. And for those of you that don't know, or at least at the time, Victoria was leading the way in wind farm energy. So this is quite exciting. Obviously, there's still an impact from wind farms, but the fact that it's renewable, I think is super exciting. And there are some environments, especially west out towards the Grampians, that have been heavily cleared in the past that are relatively flat, that actually are quite suitable for wind farms. But this one in central Gippsland, east of Melbourne, was a bit unusual in that it was located, or proposed to be located, in the Strzelecki Ranges. And Strzelecki Ranges, as the word suggests, are quite hilly and are interspersed with forestry plantations. So there's some beautiful examples of damp forest and beautiful riparian wet kind of habitat out that way. But there's also been a lot of clearing that's gone on as well. So it's a bit of a matrix. And that logging industry has been in place for quite some time. So people have the communities got quite used to logging. They weren't so used to the idea of a wind farm coming in. And I think a lot of that was the unknown and the aesthetics of a wind farm as well that they were worried about. There were 2 nationally significant species that we knew were there from doing surveys. One of these was the Strzelecki gum, and another was the growling grass frog. And both were found very close to where they were planning on putting some of these turbines. So it involved a lot of survey work. First of all, to locate these species at such a huge area, but then secondly, to coordinate the actual final design of where these turbines were going to go. So luckily, the developer in this case was really quite amenable and open to the idea of being flexible to reduce the impact. And there's definitely an incentive there for the developer to reduce impact, because if they can prove that they're not having a significant impact, that they're able to avoid these, what they call under the EPBC Act, matters of national environmental significance, then that means a lot less time for that project to be approved, or at least for the assessment process to take place. So in this case, it was a fairly positive outcome in that there was no direct impact to these species. And I left before this project completed, but generally if there had been any impacts to these species, then we would have to source offsets, so find habitat elsewhere that is known to have either Strzelecki gum or growling grass frog before any development could take place. So that just gives you a bit of insight into, I guess, how the EPBC Act is applied when a proposed project is referred and is likely to have a significant impact. So the process is, first of all, it's referred, and then if it's found that, yes, it is a controlled action, yes, it will have a significant impact, then it needs to go through this assessment process to source offsets, etc., before anything can happen. I think I've probably already touched on some of the challenges, but I guess just the huge scale of the project. Anytime we went out there, it would be a full week in the field, and a lot of driving around from site to site. Just the complexity of avoiding impacts, because you can't just think about turbines, you've got to think about access roads. And then also just dealing with community opposition. I myself found it surprising that there was so much opposition in a landscape that was already quite disturbed. But at the same time, I was quite happy about the fact that there was that interest in species like wedge-tailed eagle as well, that even though they're not listed as nationally significant, people still value. So all in all, a very interesting project. Another one that I'd like to speak about briefly perhaps was a water pipeline project. And this one was located in Victorian Volcanic Plain. The two significant species that were found here, or that were found to potentially occur here, was striped legless lizard in the photo there, and grey box grassy woodland. We set up 10 tile checks, so using roofing tiles that you can kind of see in that photo there. They're extremely heavy, but they do a good job of finding lizards and incidentally snakes as well, which can be interesting. And luckily for this project, we didn't find any striped legless lizard. However, the pipeline was going to intersect some grey box grassy woodland, and this project got delayed and delayed and delayed because they couldn't actually source any grey box grassy woodland. It's such a threatened community because of all the development that's occurred in this bioregion that I can't actually say if they were able to ever source it, because again, I left the project, I left the company. But yeah, just an example of the difficulty sometimes of finding those offsets, and that puts pressure on the company to then change their project plan and avoid that altogether, which is positive. But sometimes that's not always the case. So that leads me to my current role with Birdlife. I was so happy to work for an NGO again and work for a company that has such conservation focused values, and especially for birds, because I've always really loved birds. My role is, and I've been there since March of last year, and my role, as Arma mentioned, is the Conservation Action Plan Coordinator for the Mallee bird and the woodland bird caps. The Mallee bird cap has been around since 2015 and followed on from some huge fire events that happened in that region to try and protect, in particular, the Mallee emu wren, where the Mallee emu wren is now extinct from South Australia and only occurs in some locations, including Murray Sunset National Park in Victoria. So there was motivation after this huge fire to have a strategic plan put in place to protect some of these threatened Mallee species. Both the caps engage with government, NGOs, academics, landholders in some cases, to think about how we can deliver on outcomes for birds across a really large area, and what are the priorities for threatened species. This is just the temperate woodland bird cap, which was finalised at the end of last year. And a little bit of background there is that we have 3 working groups. I'll just go to the next slide. 3 working groups that are based around the top 3 management interventions for the next couple of years. And so the key areas for the next couple of years will be protecting priority areas, engaging the wider community, and restoration and revegetation. So the woodland cap covers a huge area, including southeast Queensland, all the way down to southeast South Australia and Tasmania. It covers mostly temperate woodlands, but because it's based on bird historical distributions, it also extends, like I said, into southeast Queensland. And the goal now is to really target some priority, focus on priority areas. There are a lot of projects already going on that we might want to expand upon, and there are also some species that haven't received as much focus as they should. So by getting people together, we're hoping to, in a lot of ways, try and target some funding. And one example of this is a new project in Southwest Victoria. So this is a partnership called the Victorian Landscape and Conservation Partnership that includes 6 partners. So Birdlife, Bush Heritage, Trust for Nature, Zoos Victoria, Greening Australia, and Odonata. And at the moment it's in the very early stages, but this partnership has identified a few projects. This Southwest Woodland Birds program is just one, and the rough program area is, as you can see on the map there. So it includes a very, very large area that's going to target species 7 focal species that are actually included in the woodland cap. So these include the crested tractit, the eastern crested tractit, purple-crowned lorikeet, southeast red-tailed black cockatoo, and a few others. And the next couple of months will be interesting because we're planning a workshop for August, where we're going to be talking to other people, including CMAs and Aboriginal corporations, to see what level of interest they may have in being involved. And then we'll be targeting priority areas with the idea that this partnership will really identify some gaps in the landscape. And there might be some current work on the ground, whether it's in habitat protection, restoration or revegetation, that we could expand on. So finally, just some takeaways and reflections, I guess, in terms of thinking about your own careers or next steps going forward. Some of my thoughts and learnings along the way were just to manage expectations, that every job's gonna give you something different and it's not going to be the perfect job, but there's always something to be learnt from each one. And especially keep in touch with people, because as I found today, you'll never know when you'll cross paths again, and often it's the people that you remember. So thanks for listening.